Rain does something strange to the inside of an elevator. It makes the air feel thinner, like the whole box is holding its breath along with you. I remember that most of all, the breath I was holding, and the little square of glossy paper sliding out of my coat pocket when I reached for my keys. I didn't notice it fall. I noticed the silence after it landed, a soft slap against the floor that seemed too loud for something so small. I was 26 years old, 7 weeks along, completely alone in a city that didn't care whether I ate dinner or not. And I was standing in an elevator with a stranger who smelled like cedar and rain and something warmer underneath, like bread left to rise near a window. Alpha. I knew it the second the doors closed. My body knew it before my mind caught up, the way an Omega's body always does, some ancient alarm bell ringing quiet and insistent in the base of my skull. I bent to grab the picture at the same moment he did. Our fingers didn't touch. I want to be honest about that, because in every story I'd ever half believed as a teenager, this was the part where the hands brushed and the whole world tilted sideways. It didn't happen that way. His hand simply got there first, because his arms were longer, and he held the little black and white photograph up to the fluorescent light like he was trying to work out what he was looking at. I watched something shift across his face. Recognition, maybe, or the absence of judgment, which felt like its own kind of miracle. Yours? He asked, voice low enough that it didn't fight with the hum of the elevator cables. I could have lied. I thought about it, actually, for one full second. Could have said it was my sister's, my friend's, anyone's but mine. But there was something about the quiet way he held it, like it was already precious to him simply because it was fragile, that made lying feel like a small betrayal of the thing itself. Of her or him, I didn't know yet. Yes, I said. My voice cracked on the single syllable, which was humiliating and also somehow a relief, like a valve releasing pressure I hadn't known was building. He handed it back to me with both hands. Not one, both. The way you'd return something borrowed and precious to a museum. His fingers finally did brush mine, then warm and dry, and I felt the graze of it travel all the way up my arm and settle somewhere behind my sternum. A small heat that had no business existing between two strangers in a rent-controlled apartment building on a Thursday evening, except I refused to say the word Thursday because that isn't how I want to remember it. I want to remember it as the evening the rain sounded like static and a man I didn't know looked at a photograph of a heartbeat that wasn't his and didn't ask a single invasive question. "Congratulations," he said, and then, like he could hear how insufficient that word was, added, "That's a big thing to be carrying around in your pocket." I laughed. It surprised both of us, I think, the sound too big for the small steel box we were standing in. "It's actually a very small thing," I said. 2 centimeters, if the doctor's ruler is to be believed. Something in his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like the shadow a smile casts before it arrives. "I meant the weight of it," he said, "not the size." The elevator dinged. 4th floor. Mine. I hadn't even realized we'd been rising, hadn't realized how much taller he was than me until I stepped past him toward the doors and had to tilt my chin up to catch his eyes one more time. "Thank you," I told him, "for not making it weird." "I don't know how I'd have made it weird," he said, and there was something dry and warm in it, an ease that didn't match the tight, careful way most alphas talked to unmated omegas. All posture and scent checking and unnecessary chivalry. He just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, unbothered, like the strangest thing about the last 90 seconds of his life was the weather. I stepped out. The doors started to close, and right before they sealed shut, I heard him say, "So quiet I almost missed it. I hope it goes well for you, both of you." I stood in the hallway of the 4th floor for a long time after that, listening to the elevator hum back down through the building's bones. My hand pressed flat over the picture in my pocket like I was checking a pulse, and mine was racing. I didn't even know his name yet. I wouldn't learn it until 3 days later when I saw it printed under his photograph on the building directory in the lobby. Dominic Holmes' apartment, 602, and felt something in my chest do a small, foolish somersault at the shape of the letters. I should explain what I was running from that evening, because I don't think this story makes sense without it. 6 months earlier, I'd been someone else. Not literally. Same face, same stubborn cowlick that never lay flat no matter how much product I used. Same habit of chewing the inside of my cheek when I was nervous, but someone who believed, with the confident stupidity of the recently in love, that the person sharing his bed was building a life with him rather than borrowing one. His name doesn't matter. I've decided that somewhere between the third and fourth month of being pregnant and alone, that his name gets to matter less and less until eventually it doesn't matter at all. The way a bruise fades if you stop pressing on it. What matters is that when I told him standing in our kitchen with a test in my hand and my heart in my throat, he went very quiet and then very cold. And within a week his belongings were gone from the apartment, and so was he. And the lease reverted entirely to my name, because apparently that had been the plan all along. His name was never on it to begin with. My parents were 3 states away and had opinions about omegas who got themselves in trouble before bonding, opinions I wasn't ready to hear voiced out loud, so I hadn't told them yet. My best friend Priya had moved to another country for a research fellowship 4 months prior, and we were down to voice messages sent into the void of different time zones. My coworkers knew me as competent and quiet, the guy in accounting who brought good coffee and kept his head down, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as my body would let me. Which, judging by the way my slacks had started pinching at the waist, was not going to be very much longer. So there I was, 26 pregnant alone, carrying a photograph of a 2-centimeter heartbeat in my coat pocket like a talisman, because somehow holding the actual paper made it feel more real and less like something that might slip away from me too, the way everything else had. And then there was a stranger in an elevator who held it like it mattered. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Strangers are kind sometimes. That's just a fact about the world, unconnected to me, unconnected to the particular way his voice had dropped when he said, "I hope it goes well for you both of you." Like he'd already decided we were a unit worth hoping for. I told myself that, and then I spent the better part of a week finding excuses to take the elevator instead of the stairs. Even though the stairs were better for me and my doctor had said as much at my last appointment, some encouraging line about gentle exercise being good for early pregnancy, I ignored her advice in favor of standing in a steel box for 40 seconds at a time, hoping he wasn't there. Not the second day, not the third. By the 4th day, I'd convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, colored it more tender in memory than it had actually been. The way lonely people do with small kindnesses, turn them into more than they are because we're starving for them. On the 5th day, I got into the elevator on the ground floor, pressed 4, and watched a hand shoot between the closing doors to stop them. He stepped in wearing running clothes, breathing a little hard, dark hair damp at the temples, and when he saw me, his whole face did something unguarded and pleased before he could stop it. Before the alpha reflex of composure caught up and smoothed it back into something more careful. "You're the elevator ghost," he said. "I was starting to think I invented you." "I've been taking the elevator on purpose," I admitted, before my brain could catch up with my mouth and stop it. "In case you were in it." I don't know what possessed me to say something so nakedly true to a man whose full name I'd only just learned from a directory board. Maybe it was the hormones. Maybe it was 6 months of holding everything so tightly that the muscles in my chest had started to cramp from the effort, and this was simply what happened when a person finally let go of something. Even a small something. Even one honest sentence to a stranger in gym shorts. He didn't laugh at me. That was the first thing I loved about him, though I wouldn't have used that word yet, wouldn't have dared. He simply looked at me for a long moment, something warm and careful moving behind his eyes, and said, "I've been taking the stairs slower than usual, in case you were on them." The elevator arrived at 4. Neither of us moved for a second. "I'm Ernie," I said. "Ernie Wheeler." "Dominic Holmes," he said, like he was giving me something. "602, if you're ever taking the stairs and want company." I stepped out into the hallway with my heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar, something that felt dangerously close to hope, and I let myself feel it for exactly as long as it took to walk to my door. And then I pushed it back down where it belonged because hope was expensive and I had a baby to think about, and babies didn't run on hope. They ran on stability and rent paid on time and a parent who didn't fall apart every time a kind man said his name in an elevator. Here is a thing about pregnancy that nobody warns you about when you're an omega who got pregnant, the unplanned way, without a partner. Without the soft cushion of a pack or a mate's steady presence, your body starts making demands you can't always meet alone. By week 10, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with willpower. By week 11, certain smells made me want to weep. The particular burnt plastic smell of the office microwave, the chemical sweetness of a coworker's perfume, my own shampoo, which I had to switch 3 times before I found one my body would tolerate. By week 12, I fainted in the stairwell of my office building, caught myself against the railing hard enough to bruise my palm, and sat there on the concrete step for 10 minutes with my head between my knees. Terrified and furious, and so lonely before I found the strength to stand up and go back to my desk like nothing had happened. I didn't tell anyone about that. I went home that night, made myself dinner I didn't have the appetite for, and cried quietly into a dish towel in my kitchen with the water running so the neighbors wouldn't hear, which is a stupid, small thing to admit, but it's true. And this story doesn't work if I only tell you the pretty parts. There was a knock on my door around 8 that evening. I almost didn't answer it. Swollen eyes, blotchy face, not fit to be seen by anyone. But something made me open it anyway, maybe just the exhausted momentum of a body that had run out of other options. Dominic stood in the hallway holding a paper bag that smelled like ginger and something starchy and comforting. "I made too much," he said, which was such an obvious lie that I almost laughed through my tears. Congee. My grandmother used to make it when anyone in the family was sick or tired or just having a hard week, and I thought, He stopped. His eyes moved over my face, the redness, the general wreckage of me, and something in his posture changed, dropped its casual pretense entirely. "Ernie." What happened? I don't know why I told him. Maybe because he'd asked with his whole attention, instead of the polite half-attention most people offer a neighbor. Maybe because I'd been holding it alone for so long that the dam had simply worn thin in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. I told him about the stairwell, the fainting, the 10 minutes on the cold concrete step, and I watched his jaw tighten, watched the muscle there flex like he was holding something back by physical force. "You should have called someone," he said. "I don't have anyone to call," I said, and it came out flatter and more honest than I meant it to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he held out the bag. "You do now, if you want." I let him in. I want to be clear that I made that choice, with my eyes open, not out of some helpless omega instinct toward the nearest capable alpha, but because something in the offer felt different from every other kindness that had come with strings attached in my life. He didn't touch me. He didn't hover. He set the congee down on my counterfound bowls without asking where they were kept, which meant he actually asked quietly and waited for me to point. And then he sat across from me at my small kitchen table and ate his own bowl slowly like he had nowhere else to be in the entire world. "Tell me about the doctor," he said eventually. "Are you seeing someone good?" "A midwife, Dr. Osei. She's kind, but her office is across town and I take the bus, and some mornings the bus makes me sick before I even get there." "I have a car," he said, simple as that, like it wasn't an offer that made my throat tighten unexpectedly. "I work from home 3 days a week. If you ever want a ride, you only have to ask." "I don't want to be a burden," I said, which was the truest thing I'd said all evening, truer even than the crying. Dominic set down his spoon. He looked at me with an expression I would come to know very well over the following months, patient, a little stubborn, entirely unwilling to let a lie stand unchallenged even when the lie was one I was telling myself. "You dropped a picture of your baby's heartbeat in an elevator," he said, "and I picked it up, and it didn't cost me anything to hand it back to you. That's what kindness is supposed to feel like, Ernie. Weightless for the person giving it. You're not a burden. You're just a person who's had to carry too much by himself for too long, and I happen to have 2 free hands." I didn't cry again that night, though it was a near thing. I finished my congee and we talked, not about the pregnancy, not really, but about small things. The kind of things you learn about a person in the early, careful stages of something neither of you has named yet. He told me he was an architect, that he'd moved to the city 2 years ago after a bond that hadn't worked out, that he liked running because it was the only time his mind went quiet. I told him I did the books for a mid-sized textile company, that I'd wanted to be an illustrator once, a long time ago, before life got practical. He asked to see my drawings. I told him maybe someday, and meant it, and was surprised by how much I meant it. When he left, he paused in my doorway, one hand braced against the frame. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. I really did make too much kanji. There's a whole other batch in my fridge that's going to go to waste otherwise. "You're a terrible liar," I told him. "I'm an excellent liar," he said. "I'm just choosing not to be one with you." I closed the door after he left and stood there for a long moment with my hand pressed flat against the wood, feeling something in my chest that I hadn't felt in 6 months. Not hope exactly. Something quieter and sturdier than hope. Something that felt, for the first time since the test had turned pink in my shaking hands, like the ground under my feet might actually hold. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. Weeks folded into each other after that, softer than I expected weeks to be. Dominic drove me to my appointments on the days he worked from home and on the days he didn't. He left small things outside my door before he left for the office. A ginger candy taped to a note that said, "For the nauseas," a paperback novel he thought I'd like once memorably. A pair of thick wool socks with a note that just said, "Your feet are always cold. I've noticed, don't argue. Ack." I did argue, every time, out of some reflex left over from a life where kindness always turned out to have a price tag hidden somewhere in the fine print. He never once asked me to pay it. I met Dr. Osei for my 16-week appointment on a bright, cold Saturday, and Dominic drove me there in comfortable silence, the radio playing something low and instrumental, his hands loose and easy on the wheel. In the waiting room, he sat 2 seats away from me, close enough to be present, far enough to give me room, and when the nurse called my name, he stood up automatically before catching himself. "I'll be right here," he said, sitting back down. "Whatever you need." I don't know what made me turn around in the doorway. Maybe it was the particular quality of loneliness that comes from walking into a room alone to hear your own child's heartbeat for what might be the last time before things start to feel truly, permanently real. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I just wanted him there. "Do you want to come in?" I asked. "You don't have to. I don't want to hear it by myself again." Something moved across his face, quick and startled and deeply glad, before he smoothed it into something calmer. He stood and followed me back, and sat in the chair beside the exam table with his hands folded carefully in his lap, like he was trying to take up as little space as possible, while still being exactly where I'd asked him to be. "Dr. Teresh." Osei squeezed the gel onto my stomach, moved the wand, and the room filled with that particular underwater whooshing sound, fast and steady and impossibly alive. I felt my eyes fill without meaning them to. Beside me, I heard Dominic's breath actually catch, a small sharp inhale he probably thought I didn't notice. "Strong heartbeat," Dr. Osei said, smiling at the screen. 152 beats per minute. Right where we want to be. "That's..." Dominic started and stopped and cleared his throat. "That's good. That's really good." I looked over at him. He was staring at the screen with an expression I didn't have a name for, yet something between wonder and ache. The look of a man watching something he had no claim to and loving it anyway helplessly, without permission from anyone including himself. "Do you want to know what we're having?" Dr. Osei asked me. "We can usually get a good guess around now if you'd like." I hadn't planned to find out that day, but something about the warmth in that small room, the steady thrum of the heartbeat still echoing in my ears, the man sitting beside me who had shown up for every appointment even though nothing bound him to me but choice, made me say yes before I'd fully decided to. "It looks like you're having a girl, Dr. Girl," Osei said, after a moment of careful looking. Though we'll confirm again at the anatomy scan. A girl. I said the word out loud, testing its weight, and beside me, Dominic made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite something else. And when I looked at him, there were tears standing in his eyes that he was blinking back with the fierce, embarrassed determination of a man who did not consider himself someone who cried in doctors' offices. "Sorry," he said. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm." "Don't apologize," I said, and reached over without quite deciding to, and took his hand. His fingers closed around mine immediately, like they'd been waiting for permission the entire appointment. "I'm glad you're here." "I'm glad you asked me," he said, voice rough. We stayed like that until Dr. Dection. Osei finished, our hands linked on the edge of the exam table, and neither of us mentioned it afterward in the car or in the elevator. Or standing outside my door as the afternoon light went gold and long across the hallway carpet. But something had shifted. I felt it the way you feel. Weather changing before the sky itself gives any sign. A pressure in the air, a held breath, the sense that something was coming and there was no longer any use pretending otherwise. That night, after Dominic left, I sat at my kitchen table with a sketchbook I hadn't opened in over a year and drew, without quite meaning to, the shape of a hand closing around another hand. I didn't show it to anyone. I put it in a drawer and told myself it was nothing, a reflex, muscle memory from a life where I used to make sense of my feelings on paper before I trusted myself to say them out loud. But I looked at it again 3 days later, and then again the day after that, and I stopped pretending it was nothing. I want to tell you about the night everything cracked open because I think it's the hinge this whole story turns on. And I don't want to rush past it the way I rushed past it in my own memory for a long time afterward, half convinced I'd imagined the intensity of it. It was week 19. I'd had a hard day, a difficult conversation with my mother on the phone the first time I'd told her, and it had gone about as poorly as I'd feared it would. Her voice tight and disappointed in a way that made me feel 14 years old again, small and wrong. I hadn't told her about Dominic. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't yet have the words for what he was to me, and I wasn't ready to have my mother's disapproval attached to something I hadn't even named for myself. I was standing in my kitchen when there was a knock at the door, softer than his usual knock, almost tentative. "I heard you on the phone," he said when I opened it. "The walls in this building are thinner than they should be." I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear some of that, and I'm sorry if that's an invasion, but I wanted to check on you. I should have been embarrassed. I was too tired to be embarrassed. I just stood there in my doorway with my hand on the frame, feeling the whole weight of the day pressing down on my chest, and something in my face must have given me away completely. Because Dominic stepped forward without asking and pulled me into his arms. I want to describe what that felt like honestly, because I think it matters. It wasn't the desperate, hungry thing I'd expected an alpha's embrace to feel like, all those overheated words from novels I'd read as a teenager, about claiming an instinct and being overwhelmed. It was steady. It was warm in a way that had nothing to do with body heat and everything to do with intention. His hand spread flat and careful between my shoulder blades. His chin resting light against the top of my head, his whole body angled to shelter without crowding. "I'm sorry," I said into his shirt, muffled and stupid. "You shouldn't have to deal with me falling apart on a Tuesday night." "I don't mind Tuesdays," he said, and I felt the low rumble of his voice through his chest, and something in me that had been clenched tight for 6 months. Finally let go. I cried properly for the first time since he'd found me with the kanji. Not delicate tears, but the full ugly kind, shoulders shaking, breath coming in hitches, 6 months of loneliness and fear, and the particular grief of loving someone who left finally finding an exit. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't offer platitudes or advice. He just held on, murmuring low things I couldn't quite make out the words of but understood anyway, the tone of them, steady and certain. "I've got you. I'm not going anywhere. Take whatever time you need." When I finally quieted, we were sitting on my couch, though I didn't remember moving there. His arm was around my shoulders, my head tucked against him, and the baby chose that exact moment to move, a small, distinct flutter low in my belly. The first time I'd felt anything like it clearly enough to be sure. "Oh," I said, sitting up straight. "Oh, I think she just moved." Dominic went very still. "Can I?" he started, and stopped himself, visibly reeling the request back in. "Sorry, that's not. You don't have to let me." "You can," I said, and took his hand and pressed it flat against the curve of my stomach where I'd felt the flutter. We waited. Nothing happened for a long moment, long enough that I started to think I'd imagined it after all. And then there it was again, small and certain, a tiny shift beneath his palm. Dominic made a sound I'd never heard a grown man make before, something caught between a laugh and something rawer, and when I looked up at him, his eyes were bright and wet and completely undefended. "Hi," he said to my stomach, absurdly, quietly. "Hi, you." I don't remember deciding to kiss him. I remember the space between us closing slow enough that either of us could have stopped it. Neither of us did, and then his mouth was against mine, careful at first. Like he was asking a question with his lips instead of his voice, and when I answered by pressing closer, his hand came up to cradle the side of my face like I was something rare and worth handling gently. It wasn't long. It wasn't heated in the way I might have expected from 6 months of romance novels and lonely nights imagining what it might feel like to be wanted again. It was soft and searching, and when we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine and breathed out, slow and unsteady. "I have wanted to do that," he said, "since the elevator. I want you to know that. Not because of—" He stopped, seemed to search for the right words, "not because of the baby. Before I even knew about her. I wanted to do that from the second you laughed at something I said, and the whole hallway seemed brighter for it." "I've been drawing you," I admitted, which felt like a bigger confession than the kiss had been. "In my sketchbook." I told myself it was nothing. Was it nothing? No, I said. It was never nothing. He kissed me again, slower this time, and I let myself believe, just for that night, that maybe I'd found the ground I'd been searching for since the day my old life fell out from under me. Maybe it had been waiting in apartment 602 the whole time, patient and steady, holding a bag of kanji and a heart he hadn't planned on giving away. I wish I could tell you it was smooth after that. It wasn't. Nothing worth having ever seems to be, and I've made a kind of peace with that, looking back, though it didn't feel peaceful while I was living through it. The first real trouble came from my own fear, which is always the hardest kind to fight, because it doesn't announce itself as an enemy. A week after the kiss, Dominic asked me gently over dinner at his apartment, the first time I'd been inside it. All clean lines and warm wood and one wall covered in careful architectural sketches. Whether I wanted to make things official, not bonded, not yet, nothing that permanent or that fast, just official. Boyfriends. A word with edges instead of the soft, undefined space we'd been living in. I panicked. I want to be honest about that too. I told him I needed time, which was true. But I also told him, in a voice gone tight and defensive, that I didn't want him committing to something out of pity. That he didn't have to play house with a pregnant Omega just because he had a good heart and bad timing. His face did something I hadn't seen before, hurt, plain and unguarded, before he covered it. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked. "Pity?" "I don't know what to think," I said, and my voice cracked in a way I hated. "I've been wrong before, Dominic. I thought someone loved me before, and it turned out he loved the idea of an easy life more. And the second things got complicated, he was gone before I'd even finished crying. I can't do that again. I especially can't do that to her." I put a hand over my stomach, 21 weeks along now, the shape of her undeniable under my shirt. I need to protect her from people who leave, even if that means protecting her from you before you've decided to. Dominic was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, the way you'd speak to something wounded that might bolt if startled. "I'm not going to pretend I understand exactly what he put you through," he said. "But I need you to hear this, and I need you to actually hear it, not just wait for me to stop talking so you can protect yourself again. I have had 8 months to walk away from you, starting the day I picked up that photograph. I could have handed it back and gotten in the elevator alone the next day and never thought about you again. I didn't. I kept taking the stairs slower. I kept finding reasons to bring you soup. I sat in a doctor's office and cried at the sound of a heartbeat that has absolutely nothing to do with my blood, because somewhere in the last few months, without meaning to, without planning to, I fell in love with you, Ernie, and with her, and that is not the kind of thing that happens to a person who's looking for an escape hatch. That's the kind of thing that happens to a person who's found something he wants to keep. I didn't have an answer for that, not right away. I sat there with my hand still resting on my stomach, feeling her shift beneath my palm, like she was listening too, and something in me that had been braced for impact for 6 months, finally cautiously began to lower its guard. I'm scared, I admitted. I'm scared that if I let myself believe you, and I'm wrong, I won't survive it a second time. Not the way I am now, not carrying her. Then don't believe me all at once, Dominic said. Believe me a little at a time. Let me prove it in small pieces, the way I have been. I'm not asking you to hand me your whole heart tonight. I'm asking you to let me keep showing up, and to actually let yourself notice when I do. I stayed at his apartment much later than I meant to that night, talking, not resolving anything fully, but softening around the edges of it, and when he drove me the one floor down in the elevator, an absurd, tender little joke between us by then. He kissed my forehead at my door and said, "Same time tomorrow?" The way he had the very first night, and I said yes and meant it more than I had the first time. Somewhere in those early weeks of believing him a little at a time, I learned the shape of Dominic's own history, the parts of him that had made patience such a natural language for him instead of a performance. It came out on a Sunday, unhurried, both of us sprawled on his living room floor, surrounded by blueprints he was supposed to be reviewing for work and wasn't, the afternoon light slanting gold and lazy across the hardwood. "Can I ask you something?" I said, tracing a finger along the edge of one of his drawings, a house with a courtyard at its center, open to the sky, and you can tell me it's none of my business. "You can ask me anything," he said, setting his pen down. "I might not always have a graceful answer, but I'll never tell you it's none of your business. Not you. You mentioned once that you moved here after a bond that didn't work out. You've never really told me about it." Something crossed his face, not pain exactly, more like the careful stillness of a person handling an old wound to make sure it's actually healed before touching it in front of someone else. "His name was Callum," he said. "We were together almost 4 years. I thought. I was so certain, Ernie, the way you're only certain about things when you're young enough to have never been properly wrong yet, that we'd bond eventually, that it was just a matter of time. I built us a whole life around that certainty. I designed the house we were going to build together. That courtyard you're looking at right now was supposed to be ours. What happened? He met someone else on a work trip, told me about it very gently, very kindly, in the exact tone you'd use to tell someone their dog had died of natural causes, rather than anything anyone could have prevented. Dominic's mouth twisted, not quite bitter, more rueful, the humor of a wound examined from a safe distance. He wasn't cruel about it. That was almost the worst part. I couldn't even be properly angry, because he hadn't done anything wrong except stop loving me, and you can't really blame a person for the stopping. You can only grieve it. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it fully. "Don't be. Not anymore. I spent about a year being sorry enough for both of us." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. An absent, tender gesture that had become so natural between us, I barely registered it as remarkable anymore, except in moments like this one, when I caught myself marveling at how easily he touched me like I was already his to touch. But I'll tell you what I learned from it, because I think it's the reason I didn't run the other direction the day I found out you were pregnant with another man's child. I learned that love isn't really about certainty at all. Callum and I had certainty in spades, right up until the day we didn't. What we didn't have was the daily choosing. The showing up on the ordinary days when nothing dramatic is asking to be proven. I've stopped trusting certainty, Ernie. I trust the showing up instead. And I intend to keep showing up for you and for Ren, until showing up simply becomes what my life is made of. I didn't have words for how that landed in me, so I didn't try to find any. I just moved across the small space between us and kissed him slow, and felt him smile against my mouth, and thought, not for the first time, that I had been so afraid of being left again that I'd almost missed the entirely different shape of a man who'd already decided to stay. Telling my parents about him was its own small mountain to climb, smaller than I'd feared but real all the same. My mother's voice had gone tight and disappointed the first time I told her about the pregnancy, and I'd spent the following weeks bracing for that same tightness every time my phone rang with her name on the screen. But 3 months after that first difficult call on a Sunday evening with Dominic's hand steady on my knee for courage, I called again and told her about him. Not just that I was seeing someone, but who he was, what he'd done, the kanji and the elevator and the doctor's office, and the way he'd stood between me and my ex on a city sidewalk without a single moment's hesitation. There was a long silence on the line. "He sounds like a good man," my mother said finally, and her voice had softened into something I hadn't heard in it for months, maybe longer. "I'm sorry, Ernie. I reacted badly before. I was scared for you, and scared makes people say clumsy things instead of kind ones. I'd like to meet him, and I'd like to see you. It's been too long." They came to visit 6 weeks later, my mother and father both nervous and a little stiff in the way of people trying very hard to make a good impression after a bad start. And I watched Dominic charm my father over a grilled dinner on his small balcony with an ease that surprised even me, asking careful questions about my father's work restoring old furniture, listening with genuine attention rather than the polite performance of listening most people offered, and watched my mother's shoulders slowly unknot over the course of the evening as she watched the two of us together, the easy, unforced way we moved around each other in the kitchen, the way his hand found the small of my back without either of us seeming to notice it happening. "He looks at you the way your father looked at me when we were young," she told me quietly in the kitchen, while the men were still out on the balcony arguing amiably about wood stains. "Like you're the answer to a question he didn't know he was asking." "I'm glad, Ernie. I'm sorry it took me this long to be able to say that properly." I hugged her for a long moment, feeling something old and tender settle back into place between us. A bridge I hadn't been sure could be rebuilt after the damage of that first phone call, and thought about how much of this whole story had turned out to be about people choosing again and again to show up for each other even after a rocky start. My mother choosing to soften. Dominic choosing to stay me. Choosing slowly and with great effort to let myself be loved without flinching away from it. The baby shower happened on a bright Saturday in my 30th week, hosted in Dominic's apartment because his living room was larger than mine, and as he pointed out with a grin, because it was going to be her home too before long, so she might as well get an early welcome to it. Priya flew in for it the first time I'd seen her in over a year, and she cried the moment she walked through the door and saw the size of my belly. Hugging me so tight I had to laugh and remind her there was a person between us who needed room to breathe. "I can't believe I almost missed this," she said, wiping her eyes, looking around the apartment at the soft yellow decorations, the small stack of gifts, the quiet, obvious care in every detail. "And I can't believe you found someone like this while I was busy staring at spreadsheets on the other side of the planet. Tell me everything. Start with the elevator. I want the whole thing, don't skip a single detail." I told her the whole thing, curled up on the couch with a plate of food I was too nervous and happy to properly eat, and watched her face move through disbelief and delight in equal measure. "He sounds too good to be real," she said finally. "Are you sure he's not secretly terrible in some specific, hidden way? Leaves cabinet doors open, chews too loud?" "He leaves cabinet doors open constantly," I admitted, laughing. "It drives me completely insane. I've started leaving little sticky notes on them that just say, 'Close me,' and he still forgets half the time." "Good," Priya said, satisfied. "I was starting to worry you'd found an actual saint, and saints are exhausting to live with. A man who leaves cabinets open is a man I can believe in." Across the room, Dominic was on the floor with my father, both of them assembling a crib with the particular focused seriousness men reserve for tasks with instruction manuals, occasionally bickering good-naturedly over which piece went where. And I sat there on the couch, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world, my hand resting on the curve of my stomach, where Ren shifted lazily beneath my palm and felt. for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely and unreservedly happy. "You did good, Ernie," Priya said quietly, following my gaze across the room. "After everything, you did so good." "I got lucky," I said. "You got brave," she corrected. "There's a difference. Luck is something that happens to you. You chose to let him in every single time you could have chosen to protect yourself instead. That's not luck, that's courage. Don't shortchange yourself the credit for it." I thought about that for a long time afterward. The difference between luck and courage, between the things that simply happen to us and the things we choose again and again in small and enormous ways to let ourselves be open to. I decided, in the end, that it had probably been some of both. Luck, that a kind stranger happened to be riding the same elevator on a rainy evening. Courage, that I'd let myself keep taking that elevator, kept answering the door, kept saying yes to small kindnesses, until the small kindnesses added up to an entire life. The second trouble was less about fear and more about the world outside our small, careful bubble, and it came, as these things often do, without warning. I was 24 weeks along when my ex showed up outside my office building. I didn't recognize him at first. 6 months does strange things to memory, softens some edges and sharpens others in ways you don't expect. But then he said my name, and every hair on my body stood up at once, some old animal instinct recognizing danger before my conscious mind had caught up. "Ernie," he said. "You look—" His eyes dropped to my stomach, unmistakable now beneath my coat, and something calculating moved behind his expression that made my stomach turn. "You're further along than I thought you'd be." "What are you doing here?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I heard you're seeing someone," he said, ignoring my question entirely. "Neighbor of yours. That true?" I didn't answer. I didn't owe him an answer, and some newly hardened part of me recognized that clearly, even as my hands had started to shake at my sides. "I've been thinking," he continued, stepping closer, close enough that I had to fight the urge to step back, to not let him see how much smaller I felt standing near him now than I remembered feeling before. "About the baby. About maybe being involved. She's mine too, you know. I have rights." "You have nothing," I said, and was surprised by how much steel had crept into my own voice. "You left the second things got hard. You don't get to walk back in now that the hard part's almost over and decide you want a say in her life. That's not up to you alone to decide," he said, and something in his tone had gone cold, the mask of casual interest slipping to show something uglier underneath. "I could make things difficult for you, Ernie, legally. If I wanted to." I don't know how long we stood there, him looming and threatening in the vague, cowardly way of a man who'd never once shown up for anything difficult in his life. Me trying to hold my ground on legs that had gone unsteady with fear. What I remember most clearly is the sound of footsteps behind me, fast and purposeful, and then Dominic was there, having apparently come to walk me home on instinct or luck, or some combination of both, standing just slightly in front of me with a stillness in his shoulders that read, even to me, as barely restrained fury. "I think you should leave," Dominic said, quiet and level in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "And you are?" my ex asked, sizing him up with the particular sneer of a man who's used to winning confrontations through volume rather than substance. "Someone who's going to be here for every single day of her life," Dominic said. "Which is more than you managed to be for the first 6 months of her existence. You don't get to show up now, when it's convenient, and use the word rights like it means something to you. Rights come with responsibility. You forfeited yours the day you packed a bag and left him standing in an empty apartment." I watched my ex's face cycle through several expressions: anger, calculation, and finally something like retreat, the posture of a man who'd expected an easy confrontation and found a wall instead. "This isn't over," he said, which was such a tired, small thing to say that I almost laughed, despite the fear still thrumming in my chest. "It is, actually," Dominic said. "It's over the second you walk away and don't come back. I'd suggest you do that now." My ex left. I watched him go, my heart still hammering, And then Dominic turned to me, all that hard fury melting instantly back into gentleness, his hands coming up to frame my face, checking me over with an urgency that made something in my chest ache. "Are you all right? Did he touch you? Ernie, look at me, are you?" "I'm okay," I said, and found that it was mostly true, my voice steadying with each word. "I'm okay, you got here in time." "I will always get here in time," he said, fierce and low. "Do you understand that? I don't care what it takes. I don't care if I have to run every day for the rest of my life. I will always get here in time for you." I believed him. Standing on that sidewalk with my heart still racing and my hands still shaking, I believed him completely, and something settled in my chest that had been unsteady since the day the pregnancy test turned pink. The certainty, finally, undeniably, that I was not alone anymore and hadn't been for a while and had simply been too afraid to fully admit it. That night, in his apartment, wrapped in a blanket on his couch with a cup of tea going cold on the table because neither of us cared enough about it to drink it, I told Dominic everything. Not the edited version I'd been giving him in pieces over the past months, but the whole thing. The way my ex had made me feel small in 100 quiet ways before the big obvious one. The way I'd convinced myself for a long time that his coldness was somehow my fault, something I could fix if I just tried a little harder to be easier to love. Dominic listened without interrupting, his arm tight around my shoulders, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "I'm not going to tell you I understand exactly what that was like," he said finally. "I won't pretend to know the particular shape of that kind of hurt. But I want you to know something, and I need you to actually believe it. Not just hear it and file it away the way you do sometimes when things get too tender to sit with." He turned so he was facing me fully, his hands finding mine, steady and warm. "You are not hard to love, Ernie. You never were." He was simply incapable of loving anything that asked something of him, and that was his failure, not some flaw in you that needed fixing. I have spent the last 8 months finding out exactly how easy you are to love. It has taken no effort at all. It has been the easiest thing I've ever done. I cried again that night, but it was a different kind of crying than before. Not grief, or not only grief, but something like relief, the particular release of finally setting down a weight you'd forgotten you were carrying. "I love you," I said, and it came out simple, unguarded, no fear attached to it at all, which surprised me almost as much as the words themselves. "I think I have for a while." I was just too scared to say it. Dominic's whole face transformed, something bright and disbelieving and utterly joyful breaking across it. "Say it again," he said. "Please, I want to hear it when I'm not imagining it." "I love you," I said again, laughing now, something light finally breaking loose in my chest after months of heaviness. "Dominic Holmes, I am completely, hopelessly in love with you, and I am furious about it because I told myself I wasn't going to fall for anyone for at least another 2 years. And you ruined that plan entirely by picking up a photograph in an elevator." "I regret nothing," he said, and kissed me slow and sure, his hand coming to rest against the curve of my stomach, where she shifted beneath his palm, as if she too wanted to be part of the moment. "I love you. I love both of you. I have loved you both since before I had the right to say so, and I am done pretending otherwise. I want to tell you that everything was easy after that, but pregnancy has its own timeline, indifferent to how settled or happy your heart finally feels, and week 32 brought its own kind of fear, sharper and more physical than anything that had come before. I woke at 3 in the morning with a pain low in my back that curled around to my front, sharp enough to steal my breath and blood on the sheets when I finally managed to turn on the light. Dark and terrifying against the white cotton. I don't remember calling Dominic exactly. I remember my hands shaking too hard to properly dial, remember somehow, through panic, getting the phone to ring, remember his voice going instantly sharp and alert the second he heard mine. "I'm coming," he said, before I'd even finished explaining. "I'm already coming, don't move, I'll be right there." He was at my door in under a minute. He must have run the entire hallway barefoot, and from there everything blurred into the particular haze of crisis, his arms lifting me carefully. his voice steady and low even as I could hear the fear threaded through it. The drive to the hospital that felt both instant and endless, his hand never once letting go of mine. They kept me overnight for observation. Placental abruption. Minor but concerning enough to warrant caution, the doctor explained. Careful and clinical in the way doctors are trained to be, even when delivering frightening news. Bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy. Close monitoring. The possibility, though not yet the certainty, of an early delivery. Dominic didn't leave my side once. He slept, or didn't sleep more accurately. I caught him awake every time I stirred through the night, in the uncomfortable hospital chair pulled as close to my bed as it would go, his hand never fully releasing mine even in whatever fitful rest he managed to find. "You should go home," I told him, around 4 in the morning, guilt creeping in despite the exhaustion and fear still humming through me. "You have work in the morning." I called in, he said immediately, like the question of whether he'd stay had never actually been a question at all. "There is nowhere else I am supposed to be right now, Ernie. There is nowhere else I want to be." I looked at him in the dim hospital light, his face drawn with worry and lack of sleep, his hands still wrapped around mine, and felt something settle deep in my chest, not the frantic, grasping hope I'd felt in the early days of knowing him, but something calmer and more certain, the particular peace of finally, fully believing that someone meant to stay. "Marry me," I said, and then laughed, startled by my own words, exhaustion apparently loosening something in my brain that decorum usually kept locked down. I didn't mean to say that like that. I meant to wait for a better moment, a moment that wasn't in a hospital bed with monitors beeping. Dominic went very still. Then, slowly, a smile broke across his tired face, wide and disbelieving and entirely unguarded. "Ask me properly," he said, voice rough. "I want the real version. I don't care if it's in a hospital bed. I want it to be real." I pushed myself up a little against the pillows, took both of his hands in mine and looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who'd picked up a photograph in an elevator and never once put it back down, who'd shown up for every appointment and every hard night and every ordinary Tuesday since, who was sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair at 4 in the morning because there was nowhere else in the world he wanted to be. "Dominic Holmes," I said, "will you marry me? Not because of the baby, not because of any of this. I gestured at the hospital room, the monitors, the whole frightening night behind us. "But because I have never in my life felt as safe, or as known, or as loved, as I have felt with you since the day you handed that picture back to me with both hands like it already mattered to you. I want to build a life with you. I want her to grow up knowing what it looks like when someone loves you on purpose, every day, not because they have to, but because they choose to, again and again." "Yes," Dominic said, before I'd even fully finished, his voice thick with tears he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "Yes, of course. Yes. Ernie, I would have said yes the day I met you if I'd had any idea this was where we were headed. Yes." He kissed me then, careful of the IV in my hand, careful of the monitors, but not careful at all in the way he held my face. Like I was the single most important thing in a building full of important things, and somewhere beyond the hospital window, the first gray light of morning was starting to break quiet and steady, the way mornings do, whether or not you're ready for them. She was born 6 weeks later, 3 weeks earlier than her original due date, but strong and healthy, despite the early scare, a small, furious, red-faced thing with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs that made the delivery room nurses laugh even as they worked. Dominic cried the entire time. He'll deny this if you ask him directly, will claim it was sweat or allergies or some other transparent lie, but I was there. And I watched tears streaming freely down his face from the moment her first cry filled the room. And I have never in my life seen a man look so thoroughly, helplessly undone by joy. They put her on my chest warm and slippery and impossibly small, and I looked up to find Dominic watching us both with an expression I finally had a word for. After all those months of not quite naming it, devotion plain and total, the look of a man who had found the thing he was meant for and had no intention of ever letting it go. "What are we naming her?" he asked, voice still thick. We'd talked about names for months, circled around a dozen options without settling on anything, but looking down at her small, furious face, something simply arrived, certain and complete. "Wren," I said. "After the bird that built her nest in the awning outside my old apartment. She used to sing every morning, even in the rain, even when it seemed like she had no reason to." "Wren?" Dominic repeated, testing the shape of it, and then he reached out one careful finger to touch her tiny curled hand, and she gripped it instantly, fiercely, the way newborns do, an instinct older than either of us. "Wren Holmes. Or Wheeler. Or—" He looked at me, suddenly uncertain, the question of names and legalities suddenly mattering in a way it hadn't in the abstract months before. "Wheeler Holmes," I said. "Both of us. All the way through." "D." He smiled at that wide and unguarded, and leaned down to kiss my forehead, then hers, then mine again. Like he couldn't quite decide which of us he wanted to be closer to and had settled on simply being close to both. I think about the elevator sometimes still years later now, when Wren is old enough to ask for the story of how her parents met and delights every single time. In the detail about the photograph falling out of my pocket, as if it's the most romantic thing she's ever heard, which, to be fair, at 6 years old, it probably is. And then what happened? She always asks, even though she knows the answer, even though we've told this story 100 times by now. Tucked into her bed, with the lamp casting long shadows and Dominic sitting on the edge of the mattress with his hand resting warm on my knee. And then, I tell her, every time, the alpha picked it up, and he held it like it already mattered to him. And it turned out, in the end, that it did. Outside our window, if you listen closely on quiet evenings, you can sometimes hear a wren singing in the tree by the front step, even in the rain, even when it seems like she has no reason to. And I think of that bird sometimes as a kind of quiet blessing on the family we built out of a small dropped photograph and a stranger's steady hands, proof, if you need it, that sometimes the things that fall apart in one part of your life are only clearing space for something better, to land gently exactly where it was always meant to be. I didn't believe in that kind of thing once. I believe in it now. I have the proof of it every single morning in the warm weight of a man beside me who has never once let go of my hand since the day he first handed it back to me, and in the small, fierce singing girl down the hall who exists in some small and impossible way because a stranger in an elevator chose kindness over indifference and then chose it again and again every single day after, until kindness became love, and love became a family, and a family became the whole steady ground beneath my feet that I had once been so afraid I would never find. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.